Over the years, there's been many discussions as to what Marvel movies are at the bottom of the list and which are nowhere near it. Today, I'll be discussing some of the worst movies Marvel Studios has produced. At first, to be honest, it was kind of difficult deciding where I stand in this topic, so I've based these ratings off two factors. One, the movie's Rotten Tomatoes score, and two, my overall thoughts of them. So if you think of anything worse, I probably haven't seen it. If you do think of a worst Marvel movie, let me know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe and check out some of my other content. Leave a like on the video, and I'm probably starting to bore you, so I'll just get into it, starting at number 5. The Hulk, 2003. Now, I know what you're thinking. This wasn't that bad, and yes, I know it got a good Rotten Tomatoes score, but if I'm basing these rankings purely off my opinion, this would no doubt be at number 1. Honestly, when I first saw this movie, I was really disappointed, because when a movie based off a one-of-a-kind character is produced by a well-respected director like Ang Lee, you'd think it's a winning combination. Unfortunately, this movie just let everyone down. The worst things I can say about it is that the CGI wasn't done very well, and you could tell it was fake, even if you're just a kid and you believe everything you see. It wasn't just the animation though. Sure, I could understand the storyline perfectly well, but that doesn't make up for the fact that there were just too many comic book transitions every 5 seconds, and with that, this movie was just painful to watch. One good thing I can say in my opinion was the delivery of possibly the worst line in Marvel. While I was working on my review of The Incredible Hulk from 2008, I actually got onto this topic with my friend Finn from Vital Report, and here's what he had to say. It looks more like a random drunk hobo was hanging upside down and getting shook while he was adding the computer effects, and he was trying his hardest to make it look as bad as he could. Once he finished, the computers ended up getting half burned and they'd have to start again. However, the director was determined to get as much footage back as possible. In the end, he managed to find significantly worse looking footage than what he had. He decided he'd hire his dyslexic 3-year-old son to add any missing effects. While this was going on, his son was killed by that hobo that did the original effects. That hobo then proceeded to crap all over the computers and making the effects look purposely as bad as possible. Then he spilt his beer all over the laptops. Once the director returned, he was very happy with the final result, but hired a paralyzed child to add a few finishing touches, and eventually we received the movie Hulk. Then he added, actually that would still look significantly better than the movie Hulk. But wait, there's more! The story of Hulk is simple. A large group of studio executives were sitting around a table trying to figure out how to make an epic Hulk movie. Suddenly, George Lucas walked in. "I've found the perfect screenwriter for this new Hulk movie," he exclaimed. Turns out it was Jar Jar Binks who walked into the room with a script that had some of the worst dialogue the studio heads had ever seen. Jar Jar also demanded that they use frequent comic book transitions to make the audience feel like they were reading a comic book. Jar Jar's script was approved. The very next day, Marvel Studios hired well-respected director Ang Lee to direct Jar Jar's script. Ang decided to hire a bunch of unknown actors with very little experience. He also followed through with all of Jar Jar's demands. The budget of that movie started at $120 million. Unfortunately, Jar Jar sued the studio the majority of that money for not including a 40-minute sex scene between Hulk and 3 of the characters. After that, the company only had $10 left to add special effects and finish production. So Ang Lee hired a drunk hobo off the street and told him to make the effects look as bad as possible. The hobo was hanging upside down and demanded Ang Lee shake him while he adds the effects to the screen. The effects looked terrible, but the next day, due to a fire, all the footage was lost. Unfortunately, the director had to redo the entire thing with $8. He bought an extremely crappy child's camera to film everything, then hired his 2-year-old son to recover any lost footage. Lastly, he hired a monkey to add any missing effects. Thus, we received Hulk. The end. Alright, I think I've made my point. All in all, Hulk 2003 was a huge disappointment to critics and fans alike, and I wasted 2 hours of my life watching the horror it brought into the world. Now, moving on to number 4. Howard the Duck, 1986. Now, I will say that this movie may or may not have been better if CGI had come further by then, so the date is part of the reason this movie is towards the start of this video, but I can't blame it entirely. No, On top of the horrible animation, the plot made no sense whatsoever. I really couldn't tell if any of the actors were trying, and seriously, Howard the Duck is supposedly half the size of human, so how are we supposed to believe that? I won't spend as much time talking about it like I did for the whole 2003, but I will say that the world should have gone without a Howard the Duck movie for at least another decade. I can't say that it would have been better after time, that all depends on how CGI had been developed by then. If I were to give the movie an overall rating though, it would be way lower than possible. I hated Howard the Duck more than I hate Star Wars Attack of the Clones, and that's saying something. In fact, check out my review of it and watch it through to the end. Then you'll have a basic understanding of just how much I hated that movie. Now triple that. That's how bad Howard the Duck was in my opinion. But it somehow got a 15% Rotten Tomatoes score, and that's why it's so early on this list. Now, moving on to number 3. Elektra 2005 was a spin-off from the Daredevil movie, which I can say was better than this. I almost put Daredevil on this list, but the movies on this list are significantly worse than any other movie by Marvel. So why exactly was Elektra so bad? Well, let's start with the plot. It made no sense, like most of the movies on this list, and I really couldn't tell what was happening at all. They actually tried to make it a crossover with the Daredevil, which is probably why it really didn't work. It got an 11% Rotten Tomatoes score from critics, and I personally think it should have gotten lower. But as I say, if these rankings were based purely off my opinion, they'd all be tied at number 1. That's why I'm using the Rotten Tomatoes score as a tiebreaker. Now, moving on to number 2. Fantastic Four from 2015, more often stylized as Fantastic, just sucked. I will say that I personally like the characters in this movie more than I do in any other film on this list. But that didn't make up for the fact that I also hated the movie and what they've actually done with the group. They've taken a bunch of good characters and they've turned them into part of one of the worst films by Marvel Studios. The actor of the Human Torch actually played Eric Killmonger from the MCU's Black Panther movie, so when that was released, I realised how much of a letdown his role actually was. The movie received a 9% Rotten Tomatoes score, and personally, I don't think Fantastic ever should have existed. Now, before I get to my number 1 pick, I've carefully selected 5 more movies that almost got onto this list, but just didn't make the cut. These are my honourable mentions. Spider-Man 3. The worst thing about it would have to be that they put too many villains in there, and it really didn't work. It almost made number 5, but last time I checked, the whole 2003 didn't include Bruce Banner doing an emo dance in public. Fantastic Four, Rise of the Silver Surfer. A very crappy movie, but still a huge improvement over Fantastic. X-Men Origins Wolverine. In my personal opinion, this was the worst X-Men movie. There's probably been worse films than it, but it was still bad enough to make its way to the honourable mentions. X-Men The Last Stand. Just a little bit better than X-Men Origins Wolverine, but still a really bad movie I can't say I would suggest. If you wanted to watch a good X-Men movie, see First Class. It's the first movie in the series, and it certainly didn't give a bad name to the characters. Ghost Rider. Probably the worst movie I picked for my honourable mentions. At one point, I honestly thought this should be on the actual list, but then I decided that there's been worse. Even though it didn't make the cut, it was still bad enough to be mentioned, because it's just a really bad movie in general. Okay guys, we've counted down to the worst of the worst. Now without further ado, let's get to my number 1 pick of Marvel's worst films. I have no doubt that the worst movie by Marvel Studios is Captain America 1990. The cheesy dialogue, a plot that might as well have gone backwards, and a version of Captain America that made the writers look like villains made it the exact opposite of what a good movie should look like. It's not just the version of the hero either. Even worse than that is the real villain, Red Skull. Whoever was in charge of CGI obviously thought the villain's pain needs to be obvious. I want the audience to know what he's been through. At least Joe Johnston made it so you can look at the villain without cringing. Aside from bad CGI, no plot, both a hero and a villain that scarred me for life, and a 7% Rotten Tomatoes score, some people are actually saying this movie was good. It got a Rotten Tomatoes score of 16% from the audience. Putting that aside, what the director did was, he wanted to make an awesome movie that people like and remember, like all directors do. And unfortunately, this movie just gave a bad name to Captain America. I hated this movie almost 3 times as much as I hated Howard the Duck. If you've skipped ahead, that was number 4 on my list. The fact that it was that bad just made me have to put it on this list, so to give a grade higher than F is out of the picture. It was so bad, my overall grading would have to be an F 4 minuses. Take my word for it, you do not need nor want to see it. Well, there you have it. The top 5 worst movies by Marvel Studios. Thanks everyone for watching all the way to the end, I hope you enjoyed it. Huge thanks to Vital Report for that long description of the Hulk 2003. I've linked his channel in a card right here. Be sure to click on that. Subscribe and hit the notifications bell for both of us so you never miss an upload. In the comments below, maybe tell me what you thought of the video and maybe what your thoughts of the movies. Give your own opinions and rankings, so that's in the comments if you wanted to do that. If you liked the video, why don't you check out some of my other content? I've reviewed all of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Phase 1, and the Star Wars prequels trilogy. Soon enough, I'll start reviewing Phase 2 of the MCU, then the original Star Wars trilogies. Then I'll get into the top 5 best Marvel movies, so stay tuned. As I say, turn on notifications so you don't miss it, and I'll see you guys then.